Imagine the early morning of December 7th, 1941, in the Hawaiian Islands. The air was cool, the sunlight barely creeping over the Kolau Mountains, and the sea breeze carried the scent of salt mixed with tropical flowers. For the thousands of American servicemen stationed at Pearl Harbor, the day appeared to be no different from the countless Sundays that had come before. Some sailors were just coming off night watch, tired but relieved to see the changing of the guard. Others were preparing for the Sunday church service, while many across the base moved about lazily, looking forward to a relatively calm day. To the casual observer, nothing about this Sunday hinted at danger. Yet beneath this tranquil surface, the Pacific world was already boiling with tension. For years, relations between the United States and Japan had deteriorated. Since Japan's invasion of Manchuria in 1931, and later its brutal expansion deeper into China, Washington had grown increasingly alarmed. By 1940 and 1941, as Japan pushed into French Indochina, the United States responded with crippling economic sanctions, cutting off exports of oil, scrap iron, and other vital materials. This was no small blow. Japan imported over 80% of its oil from abroad, much of it from America. As historian Gordon W. Prang explains in his monumental work At Dawn We Slept, 1981, the embargo was not just an economic challenge, but a humiliation in the eyes of Japanese leaders, forcing them into desperate and dangerous calculations. Now picture the calm waters of Pearl Harbor itself. Mighty battleships like the USS Arizona, USS Oklahoma, and USS California lay at anchor, their gray hulls reflecting the morning light. To the sailors aboard, they were floating fortresses, symbols of American might. Yet just beyond the horizon, hundreds of miles away across the Pacific, a Japanese strike force led by aircraft carriers was already slicing through the waves, approaching with the singular goal to shatter that peace in one decisive blow. As the first golden rays touched the harbor, the contrast could not have been greater. Paradise above the surface, but beneath it, a storm was gathering. How often, one might wonder, does history disguise its most violent moments behind a mask of serenity? If we peel back the curtain of that morning, we discover that America did, in fact, have fragments of warning. U.S. intelligence had broken parts of Japanese diplomatic codes through the cryptographic system known as MAGIC, and the decrypted messages hinted at something grave. If negotiations failed, Japan would resort to war. Yet, as Roberta Woolstetter noted in her classic study, Pearl Harbor, Warning and Decision, 1962, these clues were scattered, incomplete, and never assembled into a clear picture pointing toward Hawaii. Military leaders in Washington and Honolulu shared the same assumption. Japan's first blow, if it came, would fall on the Philippines, Malaya, or perhaps British possessions in the Pacific, not on the supposedly secure Hawaiian base. This sense of complacency filtered into the very instruments of defense. At the Opana Point radar station, two young operators noticed an unusually large formation of aircraft approaching from the north. The green glow of the screen pulsed with clusters of dots, too many to be dismissed. They exchanged uneasy glances and relayed the sighting to headquarters. The response was chillingly casual. The incoming planes were assumed to be American B-17s scheduled to arrive from California. And with that, the warning was ignored. Visualize the scene. In a small wooden shack, the low hum of the radar set filled the air as the two operators tried to make sense of what they were seeing. Outside, palm trees swayed gently in the morning breeze, utterly indifferent to the storm about to break.
Down in the harbor, sailors tuned radios to Sunday music, chaplains prepared for services, and cooks clattered pans in the galley. Everything about the day radiated normalcy. The illusion of safety was complete. And yet, on the open ocean, Japanese carrier decks were crowded with aircraft being armed and readied for takeoff. In hindsight, the silence before the storm is almost unbearable. Isn't it haunting how often history's deadliest blows arrive cloaked in the ordinariness of daily life?
Far out on the restless Pacific, beyond the knowledge of those enjoying their Sunday morning in Hawaii, a massive fleet sliced silently through the waters. This was the Kido Butai, the most powerful carrier strike force the world had yet seen. 6 Japanese aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, steamed forward in formation, escorted by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Above their decks, more than 350 aircraft were prepared for one mission: to cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet in a single, stunning strike. The decision to send this force had been nothing short of a gamble of national destiny. For months, Tokyo's leadership had debated furiously. Should Japan risk war with the United States, a nation far richer and industrially mightier, or should it accept humiliating concessions to secure the oil and resources needed to fuel its empire? Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, believed there was only one path forward. According to Hiroyuki Agawa's biography, The Reluctant Admiral, 1979, Yamamoto himself had warned that if war came, Japan could run wild for 6 months to a year, but had no hope of winning a long conflict against America's vast industrial base. Yet he also argued that a preemptive strike at Pearl Harbor might shock the Americans so severely that they would hesitate to fight, buying Tokyo time to consolidate its conquests in Southeast Asia. Imagine standing on the deck of the Akagi that December morning. The smell of fuel and steel fills the air, engines rumble below, and sailors move with tense precision, knowing their mission is cloaked in absolute secrecy. No radio transmissions betrayed their position, no neutral ships spotted their passage. They were a ghost armada, moving across the ocean like a blade in the dark. The risk was enormous, but for Japan's leaders, the alternative, slow strangulation under American embargo, seemed worse. Could a single strike truly change the balance of the world? The planning for this audacious operation revealed both genius and desperation. In 1940, Japanese naval strategist Admiral Minoru Genda proposed that an attack on Pearl Harbor, if executed with carrier-based aircraft, could deliver a crippling blow. Until then, few in the world had considered the aircraft carrier as the centerpiece of naval power. Battleships, with their towering guns, still symbolized dominance at sea. But Pearl Harbor would become the proving ground for a new era of warfare. Gordon W. Prange, in December 7, 1941, the day the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, 1988, emphasizes that the strike plan combined meticulous detail with daring innovation. Aerial torpedoes had to be specially modified with wooden fins to function in Pearl Harbor shallow waters. Training exercises were staged in secret bays in Japan to simulate the harbor, and the attack waves were timed with precision to maximize surprise. Picture the practice runs. Japanese pilots swooping low over mock targets, perfecting the dive-bombing maneuvers that would soon turn battleships into blazing wrecks. Yet for all their preparation, doubts lingered. What if the U.S. carriers, absent from the harbor, became the true targets and survived to strike back? What if America's spirit only hardened instead of shattering? Yamamoto himself, though architect of the plan, remained privately uneasy. "I fear all we have done,"
he was later quoted as saying, is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve. And yet, in December 1941, the order had been given. The ships pressed forward, hidden by the vastness of the Pacific, carrying with them the fate of empires. As the waves hissed against steel hulls and the sky stretched endless above, one question hung over the fleet like a shadow. Would this gamble bring Japan victory or its ultimate ruin?
At precisely 7:48 a.m., as the peaceful calm of a Hawaiian Sunday morning lingered over Pearl Harbor, the first wave of Japanese aircraft descended out of the skies. It was as if the heavens themselves had ripped open, pouring fire and steel upon the unsuspecting sailors below. More than 180 planes roared toward the harbor in a carefully coordinated strike. Torpedo bombers skimming just above the waves, dive bombers spiraling downward with shrieking engines, and fighters cutting through the air to strafe airfields and anti-aircraft positions. The suddenness was terrifying. Men who had been lazily drinking coffee on deck or polishing brass fixtures looked up in disbelief, unable to process what was happening. Seconds later, the thunder of explosions shattered any illusion of routine. Torpedoes slammed into the sides of battleships like hammers into glass, sending geysers of water and fire skyward. The USS Oklahoma took multiple hits in quick succession, rolling onto her side within minutes, trapping hundreds of sailors below decks. The USS West Virginia staggered as torpedoes tore into her hull, flooding compartments faster than damage control could respond. As historian Gordon W. Prange describes in At Dawn We Slept, 1981, the attack unfolded with the precision of a deadly orchestra, each section of the Japanese force playing its part in perfect harmony. Imagine standing on the shoreline, the air filled with acrid smoke, the shrill cries of men calling for help, the metallic screech of ruptured steel echoing across the harbor. Above, the Japanese pilots banked and circled, dropping more bombs, the rising sun insignias flashing in the sun. In a matter of minutes, the heart of America's Pacific Fleet had been turned into a blazing inferno. The serenity of dawn was gone, replaced by chaos and terror. Could anyone have imagined that paradise would transform into hell so quickly?
The destruction was not limited to the ships anchored in Battleship Row. Japanese fighters swept over nearby airfields, Hickam, Wheeler, and Ford Island, where American aircraft were lined up neatly, wingtip to wingtip, a measure designed to prevent sabotage but tragically leaving them as easy targets. Within minutes, rows of P-40s and B-17s were riddled with bullets, bursting into flames, unable even to take off. Men on the ground scrambled desperately, some firing pistols at the sky, others diving into trenches or dragging wounded comrades to safety. At Hickam Field, barracks exploded into fireballs as bombs ripped through the buildings, killing dozens of sleeping airmen before they could even react. Roberta Wohlstetter, in her influential study Pearl Harbor, Warning and Decision, 1962, emphasizes how the surprise was not merely tactical but psychological. The sheer disbelief that the Japanese had dared to strike so boldly paralyzed many defenders in the opening minutes. Yet amid the chaos, acts of heroism emerged. Anti-aircraft gunners, many still in their undershirts, rushed to their stations and began firing wildly into the sky, sometimes without proper targeting equipment. Sailors aboard the USS Nevada, the only battleship to get underway during the attack, fought back valiantly even as bombs straddled their decks. Visualize the scene, black smoke curling upward like a funeral shroud, planes diving in relentless waves, men running through fire and debris, shouts drowned by the roar of engines. The first wave of the attack lasted less than an hour, but by the time it ended, Pearl Harbor was a tableau of devastation. Battleships lay sinking or burning, airfields smoldered, and hundreds of men were dead or dying. And above it all, the Japanese planes climbed back into the blue sky, their mission only half complete. If this was just the beginning, what horrors would the second wave unleash?
When the first wave of Japanese planes peeled away, climbing back into the Hawaiian sky after leaving behind wreckage and fire, there was a brief lull, a deceptive moment when survivors thought the worst might be over. Yet in reality, it was only the eye of the storm. At 8:54 a.m., the second wave arrived, 170 aircraft strong, composed of high-level bombers, dive bombers, and fighters. Unlike the initial assault, which had focused heavily on battleships and airfields, this wave zeroed in on completing the destruction, targeting repair facilities, dry docks, and smaller vessels that might still fight back. Men already dazed from the first attack looked up to see the black silhouettes of aircraft blotting out the morning sun once again. They braced themselves for another round of fire. Explosions erupted across the harbor as dive bombers plunged almost vertically, their bombs shrieking down with a sound that many survivors later described as the voice of death itself. The USS Nevada, already underway and attempting to make it to open sea, became a prime target. She was bombed repeatedly, forced to beach herself to avoid sinking in the channel and blocking the harbor entirely. Flames rose from the USS Arizona's shattered hulk, still burning from the catastrophic magazine explosion that had killed more than 1,000 men in an instant. The second wave was less precise than the first, but no less destructive, spreading chaos and panic across the base. As historian Samuel Eliot Morison noted in his History of United States Naval Operations in World War II, 1950, the Japanese pilots were emboldened by the devastation they had already inflicted and pressed their advantage mercilessly, even as American defenses began to stiffen. Visualize the harbor at this moment. Columns of smoke coiling upward like volcanic eruptions, debris raining down into oily waters, and the thunder of detonations echoing across the valleys of Oahu. Paradise was unrecognizable. Everywhere one looked, it was fire upon fire. Could anyone have believed just 2 hours earlier that America's Great Fleet would be reduced to this?
On the ground, the second wave deepened the human tragedy. Hickam Field, already ravaged, was struck again, with bombs ripping through hangars and igniting parked aircraft. Wheeler Field endured another round of strafing runs, bullets kicking up dirt and sparks as mechanics and pilots scrambled desperately for cover. The naval yard itself, with its workshops and fuel depots, shook under the impact of exploding ordnance. Fires spread uncontrollably, leaping from ship to shore, threatening to engulf entire facilities. Yet amidst the carnage, resistance stiffened. Anti-aircraft guns that had been silent or manned by untrained crews during the first wave now roared to life. Gunners, some wounded and operating with only partial crews, filled the sky with flak, forcing Japanese planes into erratic, evasive maneuvers. At Ford Island, sailors dragged hoses across burning decks, fighting flames even as bombs fell around them. Heroic efforts were recorded everywhere. Men plunging into oil-slicked waters to rescue shipmates, officers organizing fire brigades with whatever equipment they could find, chaplains moving fearlessly among the dying to administer last rites. In Pearl Harbor, the verdict of history, Prang, Goldstein, Dillon, 1986, the authors note how the second wave intensified the psychological shock, as defenders realized this was not a freak raid, but a deliberate, coordinated attempt to annihilate them. Imagine the sensory overload, the bitter stench of burning oil coating the throat, the deafening roar of guns and explosions, the heat of flames licking at exposed skin. By 9:45 a.m., the second wave withdrew, leaving behind a harbor transformed into a graveyard. More than 2,000 Americans were dead, dozens of ships crippled or sunk, and hundreds of aircraft destroyed. The Japanese pilots flying homeward may have felt triumphant, but in their wake, they had not cowed a nation into submission. Instead, they had lit a fire of rage that would burn hotter than any they had unleashed that morning. And so we are left to ask,
Had Japan, in delivering such devastation, sealed not America's defeat, but its own fate?
When the last Japanese aircraft banked away and disappeared over the horizon around 10 a.m., an eerie silence settled over Pearl Harbor, a silence broken only by the crackle of flames, the groan of sinking ships, and the cries of the wounded. The harbor, once the proud heart of America's Pacific Fleet, looked like a vision from Dante's Inferno. Battleships lay broken and twisted, some capsized, others smoldering from direct hits. The USS Arizona was still aflame, her shattered hull belching black smoke into the sky, while the USS Oklahoma lay on her side, trapping more than 400 men inside. The water itself seemed alive, bubbling with oil slicks that caught fire and turned the harbor into a seething cauldron. Survivors swam desperately through the burning sea, their bodies coated with thick, choking fuel, dodging debris and searching for anything that would float. On shore, medics set up improvised aid stations, turning mess halls and hangars into triage centers. Doctors and nurses worked frantically, often with limited supplies, their hands blackened by soot and blood as they tried to save men torn by shrapnel or scorched by flames. Historian Walter Lord, in his poignant account Day of Infamy, 1957, captured the raw chaos of these hours. Men clawing at overturned hulls, tapping desperately from inside, while rescuers worked furiously with torches and hammers, often too late to save them. Visualize the scene. Sailors with burned skin hanging from their arms, staggering ashore. Others collapsed on the docks as stretcher teams raced past, their faces grim. Priests knelt beside the dying, whispering final prayers amid the smoke. The once tranquil waters of Oahu had become a graveyard, and every breeze carried the acrid smell of death. How could such a paradise have turned into hell in just a few hours, and how could survivors begin to grasp the enormity of what had just happened?
Even amid such devastation, stories of courage and survival emerged like beacons in the darkness. Sailors risked their lives, diving again and again into burning waters to drag injured comrades to safety. Others climbed into half-sunken compartments, listening for faint tapping sounds and refusing to give up until every possible man was pulled free. At the Naval Hospital, overwhelmed nurses worked tirelessly, improvising with bed sheets as bandages, and morphine rationed to the most critically wounded. Civilians, too, rushed to help. Local Hawaiians opened their homes to survivors, provided food and water, and joined in the frantic rescue efforts. Yet the scale of destruction dwarfed even the greatest heroism. By day's end, 2,403 Americans were dead, more than 1,100 wounded, and the Pacific Fleet appeared crippled. 8 battleships had been damaged, 4 of them sunk. Nearly 200 aircraft were destroyed. The shock was total. Historian Gordon W. Prange, in Pearl Harbor, The Verdict of History, 1986, notes that the psychological effect was as devastating as the physical losses. For Americans, the attack shattered the illusion of safety that the Pacific Ocean had once provided. The war, until then a distant storm in Europe and Asia, had crashed violently onto their own shores. Imagine standing on the docks that evening, the sun sinking behind the smoke, the wreckage silhouetted in the dim light, the silence punctuated by the hiss of fire hoses and the muffled sobs of men who had lost shipmates. Hawaii's tropical beauty still lingered in the golden glow on the mountains, but it felt grotesquely out of place against the ruin below. Survivors looked out across the harbor, stunned, grieving, but also hardening with resolve.
For even as Pearl Harbor smoldered, a grim realization was taking hold. America had been bloodied, but not broken. Could this destruction, terrible as it was, have sown the seeds of a response far more powerful than Japan could ever have imagined?
The morning after the attack, December 8, 1941, the United States awoke into a new reality. Newspapers carried banner headlines and letters larger than any seen before. War! And radios crackled with reports that stunned citizens from New York to San Francisco. For many Americans, the attack on Pearl Harbor felt like a violation not only of their territory, but of their very sense of security. Families gathered around kitchen tables, listening intently to President Franklin D. Roosevelt's voice as it rang across the airwaves, measured yet fierce, delivering words that would become immortal, a date which will live in infamy. In those few sentences, Roosevelt captured the shock, the outrage, and the determination of a nation blindsided but not beaten. Historian David Kennedy in Freedom from Fear, 1999, emphasizes that the speech did more than declare war. It crystallized a sense of shared destiny, transforming a nation divided by debates over isolationism into one united in resolve. Imagine the scene. In small towns, shopkeepers stood still as the radio played, hands frozen over their work. In crowded cities, people craned toward public loudspeakers, faces tight with anger and fear. Everywhere, the same realization spread. The war that had consumed Europe and Asia was no longer someone else's fight. It had come to America's doorstep with fire and blood. Congress, reflecting the will of the people, responded with near-unanimous swiftness. Only a single dissenting vote stood against the declaration of war on Japan. The die was cast. Across the nation, young men lined up at recruiting stations, their jaws set, ready to avenge Pearl Harbor. Women organized blood drives, scrap metal collections, and knitted socks for soldiers. Factories that once produced cars and refrigerators now shifted gears to build tanks, planes, and ships. America, once hesitant, was now fully committed. Could the Japanese High Command, as they celebrated their tactical triumph, have possibly foreseen the tidal wave of industrial and human power they had just unleashed?
The emotional shift in America was palpable, almost overnight. Before the attack, isolationism had held a firm grip on public opinion. Many Americans remembered the horrors of World War I and saw Europe's battles as distant troubles. But Pearl Harbor shattered that illusion with a single brutal stroke. Suddenly, the abstract threat of fascism and imperialism was made real by the burning wrecks in Hawaii and the thousands of dead. Historian Doris Kearns Goodwin, in No Ordinary Time, 1994, describes how Roosevelt seized this moment of unity, calling upon the arsenal of democracy to awaken and pour forth its strength. The transformation was staggering. Detroit's automobile plants converted almost overnight to churning out B-24 bombers and Sherman tanks. Shipyards in California and along the East Coast worked around the clock, launching Liberty ships at record speed. Universities and laboratories mobilized scientists for war research, setting the stage for technological leaps that would redefine modern conflict. Visualize America in those weeks: billboards urging enlistment, ration posters on shop windows, factory whistles blowing through the night as workers hammered steel, the stars and stripes flying proudly from porches and storefronts. Communities held rallies, churches overflowed with prayers for soldiers, and school children practiced air raid drills. There was fear, yes, but it was fused with determination. The Japanese attack had awakened not just military might, but a spirit of unity that spanned coast to coast. And as if to underscore the global stakes, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States just days later, ensuring that America would now be drawn into the full global struggle of World War II. From the ashes of Pearl Harbor, the United States emerged not broken, but galvanized. Yet one haunting question remained. If this unity had been born of tragedy, how far and how fiercely would America carry this fight?
In the immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor, Japan seemed unstoppable. Their forces surged across the Pacific and Southeast Asia with dizzying speed. The Philippines fell under siege, British strongholds like Hong Kong and Singapore crumbled, and American garrisons in Guam and Wake Island fought desperately before being overwhelmed. For months, the headlines told a story of retreat and loss. Yet beneath the grim news, America was already preparing for a counterpunch. Historian John Keegan, in The Second World War, 1989, notes that the shock of Pearl Harbor acted like a forge, hardening the will of the American people and their leaders to transform defeat into determination. Factories roared to life, churning out war material in quantities Japan could never hope to match. Shipyards repaired damaged vessels with astonishing speed, salvaging even those battleships thought lost in the inferno. The USS West Virginia, raised from the mud of Pearl Harbor, would later return to fight at Leyte Gulf. Imagine the docks alive with sparks as welders worked day and night, hammers clanging, cranes lifting massive steel plates, the smell of oil and sweat thick in the air. Soldiers drilled endlessly, recruits who had never held a rifle learning discipline and precision. In classrooms and laboratories, scientists bent over blueprints, laying foundations for radar improvements, advanced aircraft, and eventually the atomic bomb. The tragedy of Pearl Harbor became not just a wound, but a rallying cry, and everywhere one could hear the vow repeated, "Remember Pearl Harbor." Could the Japanese strategists, watching their initial victories unfold, have realized that they had awakened not weakness, but a storm gathering strength across the ocean?
The true turning point came only months later, in June 1942, when the American Navy clashed with Japan near a tiny atoll called Midway. It was here that the lessons of Pearl Harbor bore fruit. Intelligence officers, having cracked portions of Japan's naval code, were able to anticipate the enemy's moves. In Miracle at Midway, Pronge, Goldstein, Dillon, 1982, the authors detail how Admiral Chester Nimitz used this knowledge to set an ambush, positioning his carriers where they could strike first. When the battle erupted, American dive bombers achieved what seemed impossible. Within minutes, 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were in flames, and a 4th, Hiryu, followed soon after. The same weapons that had devastated Pearl Harbor now turned against their former masters, and Japan's naval power suffered a blow from which it would never recover. Visualize the scene. Bombs plunging from the sky, decks erupting in fire, sailors leaping into the sea as black smoke billowed upward, staining the horizon. For the Americans, it was redemption. Pearl Harbor avenged, not by chance, but by preparation, courage, and resolve. From that point forward, the tide of war shifted. The United States, with its vast industrial resources and united people, pressed the offensive across the Pacific, island by island, never forgetting the morning when paradise had burned. The cry, "Remember Pearl Harbor," echoed in every assault, from Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima. What began as a crushing defeat had transformed into a narrative of resilience, proof that even in the darkest moments, determination can turn the course of history. And yet, as victory loomed closer, another question arose. What price would be paid to bring this war, ignited at Pearl Harbor, to its ultimate end?
When the smoke of war finally cleared in 1945 and the guns of the Pacific fell silent, Pearl Harbor remained etched into memory not just as the beginning of America's entry into World War II, but as a symbol of resilience forged through fire. The harbor itself became both a graveyard and a shrine. Sunken ships like the USS Arizona were left where they fell, their rusting hulks silently entombing the bodies of the sailors who never escaped. Even today, droplets of oil, the black tears of the Arizona, still seep to the surface, a haunting reminder of the morning when paradise was scarred.
The attack transformed American strategy forever. No longer could oceans be trusted as moats of safety. The United States emerged determined never to be caught off guard again. This resolve gave birth to a permanent global presence of American military power, from bases in Europe and Asia to fleets that patrolled every ocean. Historian Craig Nelson in Pearl Harbor, From Infamy to Greatness 2016 argues that the lessons of December 7th shaped not just the war effort, but the entire Cold War order that followed. Imagine standing on the memorial today, the white structure spanning the wreck of the Arizona, sunlight streaming through its open roof, visitors gazing silently down at the dark waters. One can almost hear the echo of explosions, the cries of sailors, the roar of engines, even though decades have passed. The legacy is not merely one of loss, but of warning. For every generation that visits, Pearl Harbor asks the same question: will you be vigilant, or will history repeat itself? And perhaps most hauntingly, how much sacrifice is demanded before nations learn the true cost of complacency?
Beyond its immediate military and political consequences, Pearl Harbor has endured in the collective consciousness as a story of transformation, from vulnerability to strength, from despair to determination. It became a narrative touchstone for the American identity, the idea that even in moments of devastating surprise, unity and resolve can lead to ultimate triumph. Films, books, and documentaries have revisited that day endlessly, each retelling blending the factual with the emotional, ensuring that the memory remains alive. Survivors who told their stories in later years spoke not only of horror, but of courage. Shipmates refusing to abandon the wounded, medics working under fire, civilians opening their doors to strangers. Doris Miller, an African-American mess attendant who seized a machine gun aboard the USS West Virginia and fired at Japanese planes despite having no training, became one of the earliest symbols of heroism and the fight for recognition in a segregated military. Such stories remind us that history is not just about ships and strategy, but about human choices made in the crucible of crisis. As historian Roberta Wohlstetter warned in Pearl Harbor, Warning and Decision, 1962, the greatest lesson is not simply to remember the attack, but to understand how warning signs can be missed, how assumptions can blind leaders, and how vigilance must be constant. Visualize the end of our story: the harbor quiet, flags fluttering against the Hawaiian breeze, the memorial gleaming white against the blue Pacific. Visitors leave in silence, carrying away not just sorrow, but reflection. And now, as you've journeyed through this story, I'll leave you with a question. If history often disguises its greatest dangers behind ordinary days, how would we recognize the next Pearl Harbor before it strikes? If you found meaning in this story, consider subscribing to this channel so we can keep exploring the powerful, untold chapters of history together, and perhaps learn lessons that still matter today.